In the early 20th century, the name Hitler did not yet echo with terror. It was just a surname and remarkable, provincial, easily lost in the noise of Europe's shifting empires. But by the 1930s, that name had become radioactive. It poisoned lives. It destroyed futures. And for one young man, it became a prison he would spend his entire life trying to escape. His name was William Patrick Hitler. He was Adolf Hitler's nephew, and during World War II, he chose to fight against Germany. This is not a story of propaganda or myth. It is a story of bloodlines, broken families, ambition, fear, and moral survival. It is the true account of a man born into history's darkest shadow who made the dangerous decision to step out of it. Long before the world learned to fear the name Hitler, it was already a fractured name, one marked by abandonment, resentment, and silence. To understand why Adolf Hitler's nephew would one day fight against Germany, it is necessary to begin not with the dictator himself, but with the broken family he came from. Adolf Hitler's father, Alois Hitler Sr., was a domineering and often violent man. He ruled his household with fear, frequent beatings, and rigid authority. His children grew up under constant tension, and many of them ran away as soon as they were able. One of them was Alois Hitler Jr., Adolf's half-brother and the man who would become William Patrick Hitler's father. Alois Jr. inherited his father's volatility. He was impulsive, unreliable, and chronically dissatisfied. In his late teens, he fled Austria and wandered across Europe, working odd jobs and reinventing himself wherever he went. Unlike Adolf, Alois had no political ambition, no ideological discipline, and no patience for responsibility. He was restless, and that restlessness would leave a permanent mark on his son's life. In Liverpool, England, Alois met Bridget Dowling, an Irish woman from a Catholic family. Their relationship moved quickly and recklessly. They married in 1910, but the union was unstable almost immediately. Alois exaggerated his background, claimed connections he didn't have, and presented himself as a man of importance. Bridget, unaware of the deeper dysfunction in the Hitler family, believed she was building a future. Their son, William Patrick Hitler, was born in 1911. But fatherhood did not anchor Alois. Within a few years, he abandoned Bridget and William, disappearing back into continental Europe. At one point, he was even accused of bigamy after marrying another woman in Germany while still legally married to Bridget. He would later serve prison time for it. William grew up knowing his father not as a presence, but as a ghost, unreliable, distant, and occasionally dangerous. Bridget raised William alone in England. She worked hard to protect him, especially as rumors began to circulate about her estranged brother-in-law in Germany. During William's childhood, Adolf Hitler was still a political extremist on the margins of society. But even then, his radical views were unsettling. Bridget reportedly feared what association with Adolf could mean for her son. William's upbringing was British, not German. He spoke English as his first language. He attended English schools. His cultural identity was shaped by Britain and Ireland, not Austria or Germany. To him, Adolf Hitler was not a leader, it was the name of a distant uncle he had never met and rarely heard about. As the 1920s ended and the 1930s began, that distance collapsed. Adolf Hitler rose with shocking speed. Newspaper headlines carried his name across Europe. His speeches electrified crowds. His party seized power. And suddenly, William Patrick Hitler realized that the man connected to him by blood was no longer just a relative, he was becoming a symbol. That realization came with fear, not pride. Because William understood something most people didn't yet grasp. Adolf Hitler was not simply ambitious. He was obsessive, controlling, and intolerant of weakness or embarrassment. And William, half Irish, half English, raised outside Germany, represented everything Adolf Hitler despised. From that moment on, William's life was no longer his own. His surname tied him to a rising tyranny. His family history placed him uncomfortably close to a man who demanded absolute loyalty and erased anyone who complicated his image. Even before William ever set foot in Germany, he was already caught in a dangerous orbit, one that would soon force him to choose between blood and conscience. This was the family no one talked about, and it was the beginning of a choice that would one day place Adolf Hitler's nephew on the opposite side of World War II. By the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler was no longer a distant political agitator shouting from beer halls. He was becoming something far more dangerous, a man reshaping Germany in his own image. As his power grew, so did his obsession with control, especially control over how the world perceived him. That obsession inevitably reached his own family. For William Patrick Hitler, life in Britain had become increasingly difficult. Jobs were scarce during the Great Depression, and his unusual surname drew uncomfortable attention. Newspapers across Europe were filled with Adolf Hitler's speeches, his rallies, his growing influence. Strangers began asking questions. Employers grew cautious. William was young, ambitious, and struggling, and he began to wonder whether his infamous connection might offer opportunity rather than danger. Then came the invitation. Adolf Hitler summoned his nephew to Germany. The message was polite, even warm on the surface, but it carried an unmistakable weight. Refusing an invitation from one of the most powerful men in Europe was not simple, especially when that man was family. William believed this could be his chance to stabilize his life. He did not yet understand that proximity to dictatorship rarely brings security. When William arrived in Germany, he entered a world unlike anything he had known. The country was disciplined, militarized, and tightly controlled. Nazi banners hung from buildings. Uniforms filled the streets. Public enthusiasm masked private fear. Everything from newspapers to conversations felt staged, monitored, and deliberate. At first, Adolf Hitler treated William with cautious generosity. He arranged employment for him, first at a bank, later at an automobile factory. These were respectable positions, and William knew he had not earned them on merit alone. His uncle's influence opened doors that would otherwise remain sealed. On the surface, it seemed like family loyalty at work, but beneath that surface lay tension. Adolf Hitler did not trust William. William was British-born. His mother was Irish Catholic. His upbringing contradicted Nazi racial mythology. To Adolf, this was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. He feared scandal. He feared journalists discovering that the Führer had close relatives who did not fit the ideology he preached. And above all, he feared losing control of the narrative. William felt it immediately. He was watched. Conversations were cautious. People spoke differently when he entered a room. Gestapo agents were never far away. What had seemed like privilege began to feel like surveillance. Every favor carried expectation. Every opportunity came with an unspoken demand for loyalty. Then, the pressure intensified. Adolf Hitler made it clear that William's future depended on a choice: abandon his British citizenship and become fully German. This was not framed as an ultimatum, but it was one. Citizenship meant allegiance. Allegiance meant obedience. And obedience meant surrendering the last piece of independence William had. William refused. The refusal marked a turning point. The warmth evaporated. The jobs became temporary. The protection weakened. Adolf Hitler's attitude toward his nephew shifted from tolerance to suspicion. William was no longer a relative who needed assistance. He was a liability who needed containment. William began to understand the truth. His uncle did not care about family. He cared about control. The atmosphere grew darker. Nazi ideology hardened. Anti-British rhetoric intensified. War loomed. William realized that remaining in Germany meant placing himself entirely at the mercy of a regime that did not hesitate to destroy inconvenient lives. And for the first time, William understood something chilling. Being Adolf Hitler's nephew did not make him safe. It made him expendable. This realization planted the seed of defiance that would soon grow into something far more dangerous: an open break with the Nazi regime, and eventually an act of rebellion that would place him on the opposite side of history. By the late 1930s, the illusion that William Patrick Hitler could exist safely within Nazi Germany had completely collapsed. What once appeared to be opportunity had hardened into entrapment. Germany was no longer merely authoritarian, it was openly hostile to anyone who did not fit its rigid vision of loyalty, blood, and obedience. William felt the walls closing in. The pressure to renounce his British citizenship returned again and again, no longer politely suggested but increasingly implied as a requirement for survival. Remaining a British subject inside Nazi Germany, especially as war approached, was dangerous. Remaining a British subject related to Adolf Hitler was worse. Every refusal marked him more clearly as a problem. His employment became unstable. Jobs offered through his uncle's influence were suddenly withdrawn or replaced with positions that kept him visible but powerless. He was paraded just enough to be monitored, yet never trusted enough to be protected. William understood the pattern: dependence without autonomy, privilege without safety. The atmosphere of fear intensified as Germany prepared for war. Foreigners were scrutinized. Surveillance increased. Rumors spread of arrests without explanation, of people vanishing after saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. William saw how quickly loyalty was questioned, and how ruthlessly dissent was punished. And he knew something others did not: that Adolf Hitler was deeply paranoid about family embarrassment. That paranoia created a dangerous standoff. Desperate and frightened, William made a reckless decision. Believing that his only leverage was information, he threatened to reveal embarrassing details about the Hitler family, stories of illegitimacy, abandonment, and dysfunction that contradicted the carefully constructed myth of Aryan virtue. It was not an act of ambition. It was an act of fear. The attempt failed. Adolf Hitler did not negotiate. He did not bend. If anything, the threat confirmed his worst suspicions. William was no longer just an inconvenience, he was a risk. From that moment on, William understood that his life could be erased quietly and efficiently. The regime did not need public executions for someone like him. An accident, a charge of disloyalty, or a sudden disappearance would be enough. The danger was immediate. In 1939, as Europe stood on the brink of war, William and his mother Bridget realized they had one narrow chance to escape. Using foreign contacts and the last remnants of Adolf Hitler's reluctant tolerance, they left Germany under the pretense of travel. There was no farewell, no protection, no guarantee they would not be stopped at the border. They made it out. Within months, Germany invaded Poland. Borders closed. War consumed Europe. Anyone trapped inside Nazi territory, especially someone with William's background, would have had no way out. For William Patrick Hitler, escape was not just physical, it was ideological. He had seen the regime from the inside, not as a citizen, not as a believer, but as a watched relative. He had witnessed its cruelty, its fear, its obsession with control. And when he finally stood on free soil again, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not hide from the war. He would not stay neutral. And he would not allow his bloodline to decide his allegiance. What followed would shock both America and Germany alike. Adolf Hitler's nephew was about to choose a side, and it would be the side fighting against the Reich. When William Patrick Hitler arrived in the United States in 1939, he believed he had finally escaped the gravitational pull of his uncle's power. America represented distance geographical, political, and moral from the regime he had fled. But he quickly discovered that while oceans could separate continents, they could not erase a name. The moment Europe plunged into war, William's surname became a burden once again. In the United States, suspicion ran high. Nazi spies were real. Sabotage was feared. Loyalty was questioned. And when American officials encountered a man named Hitler, one who openly admitted he was Adolf Hitler's nephew, alarm bells rang immediately. William and his mother lived quietly at first, giving lectures and writing articles that openly criticized Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. William spoke publicly against Nazism, trying to make it unmistakably clear where he stood. But words were not enough. He wanted action. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, America entered World War II. Millions of men volunteered for military service, and William was among them. He believed that the ultimate rejection of his uncle's ideology would be to fight it directly. The U.S. military did not agree, at least not at first. His enlistment applications were rejected repeatedly. Intelligence agencies became involved. The FBI opened files on him. Military officials feared the propaganda nightmare that could arise if something went wrong. What if he defected? What if he was a spy? What if his presence alone became a symbol exploited by the enemy? William endured years of suspicion, background checks, and delays, yet he refused to disappear quietly. In a move that demonstrated both desperation and resolve, William wrote directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the letter, he laid out his life story, his upbringing in England, his escape from Nazi Germany, his refusal to surrender British citizenship, and his complete rejection of Adolf Hitler's ideology. He did not ask for special treatment. He asked for the chance to prove his loyalty with his life if necessary. The request triggered further investigations, interviews, and internal debate at the highest levels of government. Finally, in 1944, permission was granted. William Patrick Hitler was allowed to enlist in the United States Navy. He did not receive a symbolic role. There were no safe postings or public-facing positions. Instead, he was assigned as a pharmacist's mate, a combat medical role that placed him directly in harm's way. He treated wounded sailors, tended to injuries under fire, and worked in conditions where hesitation could mean death. This was not performance, it was commitment. During his service, William was wounded in action, sustaining injuries that earned him the Purple Heart. Blood his own was spilled in a war against the regime led by his uncle. The irony was brutal, but the message was undeniable. Adolf Hitler's nephew was now fighting for the Allied cause, while Nazi propaganda would later attempt to erase or dismiss his existence. The reality was unavoidable. A man carrying the Hitler name had chosen to stand against the Reich, not in speeches or articles, but on the battlefield. For William, this was not about heroism or recognition. It was about severing the final tie to fear, to bloodline, to history's darkest legacy. He had done what many believed impossible. He had chosen his country, he had chosen his values, and he had chosen to fight the very empire his uncle built. When World War II ended, the world turned its attention to rebuilding, reckoning, and remembering. Adolf Hitler was dead. Nazi Germany lay in ruins. Trials exposed the horrors of the regime in painstaking detail. For many, the war had ended. For William Patrick Hitler, it never truly did. Victory brought relief, but not freedom from his name, from suspicion, or from history. While millions of veterans returned home as heroes, William returned as a man carrying one of the most toxic surnames on earth. Even after fighting for the United States, even after shedding blood against Nazi Germany, he remained an anomaly, too dangerous for headlines, too controversial for comfort. William understood this immediately. Public life was no longer an option. Any attempt at visibility would invite sensationalism, mistrust, or worse, misuse of his story by those eager for spectacle. The world did not want nuance. It wanted villains and heroes clearly separated. A man named Hitler complicated that narrative. So William made a deliberate choice. He disappeared. He legally changed his name to William Stewart Houston. It was not an act of shame, it was an act of survival. He moved quietly, settled into civilian life, and avoided public attention with almost surgical precision. He married, started a family, and built a career in medical laboratory work, a profession that allowed him to contribute without being seen. He almost never spoke about Adolf Hitler. When journalists approached him, he refused interviews. When historians reached out, he declined to participate. He did not write memoirs. He did not profit from his past. He did not seek forgiveness or validation from the public. This silence was intentional. William understood that memory could be dangerous. He had spent his life learning how easily stories could be twisted, weaponized, or stripped of context. By refusing to speak, he denied the world the chance to use him as a curiosity, or worse, a symbol. Even within his own household, the past was tightly controlled. His children were raised away from the spotlight, shielded from the weight of a legacy they did not choose. William was determined that the cycle would end with him. He had spent his youth trapped by bloodlines and politics. He would spend his adulthood ensuring that those chains did not pass on. William Patrick Hitler died in 1987, far removed from the chaos that defined his early life. He left behind no manifestos, no public statements, no final clarifications, just a quiet record, a man born into history's most infamous family who chose, at great personal risk, to stand against it. His story challenges an uncomfortable truth. Evil is not inherited. Loyalty is not genetic. And names do not determine conscience. In an age when ideology demanded absolute obedience, and bloodlines were used to justify horror, William Patrick Hitler made a choice that cost him comfort, certainty, and identity. He rejected the power offered by proximity. He refused the safety of silence. And when the moment came, he fought not for family, not for legacy, but for principle. History will always remember Adolf Hitler for what he destroyed, but hidden within that history is another truth, one far quieter, far less convenient, yet deeply human, that even in the darkest families, resistance can exist, that even under the heaviest shadows, people can choose light, and that sometimes the most powerful act of defiance is simply choosing the right side of history.